in spite of what the newspaper said. We are not resuming at the library yet till they get done with the painting and the new rugs, right?
Mhm.
And then, oh, by the way, you want to give a pitch for volunteers when the time comes?
Well, we don't know when it will be
But
yet.
give them a
Yeah,
heads
so-
up, they can think about it.
Yes, we will be asking for volunteers to help us move back into the library. We don't know a date yet. But you can watch on our website or Facebook.
Find out. Unfortunately, well, who was it? The football players from the university, was it?
Yeah, the second.
Helped
Yeah.
move the books all from one place to another.
Yeah.
But evidently they're not around. If anybody knows of any Husky guys, teams or whatever that are around, let Melanie know, because we're gonna ask them to come down for an hour.
Yeah.
An hour?
Yeah.
Amazing what young things can do in an hour.
Well, it was actually we had a group of volunteers on one day, and it took them 55 minutes to move everything around. And then we had the football players come back for those two little alcoves that were artists. They had some more stuff.
All righty. You pay your dues when you're young, and then hopefully someone will take care of you when you're old, right? Isn't that the sort of the contract we have? All righty. Before we get to today's topic, I want to just briefly talk about our visit from Jack Frost on Wednesday night, if I recall correctly. Melanie and I sat through in the winter our weather program, and we talked about, let me think, continental, polar air masses, which usually come down out of the northwest. Think our Canadian neighbors to the north, up there in Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba way. And so that's what I suspect happened on Wednesday night, because after some crazy weather throughout April, things seem to have settled down into more or less what we expect in May. Quite a few things, if you're an eager beaver, we're out in the garden that maybe shouldn't have been that early. So the temperature, according to the NOAA radio station, who went on and on and on about bringing in houseplants, draining hoses, covering up tender plants, it actually did drop to 28 on the hilltops. Now, normally, the hilltops, 1,000 feet higher than Wellsville or Hornell, are cooler by about 6 degrees, but not in spring and fall when you have a cold, dry air mass move in overnight like it did. And there's no wind and it's clear. Then cold air being denser actually flows down the hillsides. It's called a valley mountain breeze into the valleys. And that's why on those nights, Wellsville, Hornell, anybody in a frost hollow gets quite a few degrees colder. So what's really frustrating about listening to the news is that they forecast it, but then that next day they don't tell you how cold it got. So my guess is that some of those people down in the valley, it dropped to 25, which would do your lilacs and your apple blossoms, I think. So anybody that has information on that can call the library and let us know. Meanwhile, I went upstairs and got out all my extra towels, sheets, flannel sheets, and went out and covered up almost everything.
Oh, I'll show you the picture that.
Okay, you have a picture of what?
Jackie sent me.
Oh, Jackie.
What her husband did.
Okay, Jackie lives what? Down in Hornell?
Alfred Station.
Alfred Station, which is 300 feet lower than Alfred, which is 400 feet lower than the top of my hill.
He put all these little buckets in.
Oh, that, can you turn that so people can see?
Yeah.
Jackie's our new librarian.
I don't know.
She has a raised bed that's kind of like L-shaped.
And he put some buckets on it.
Okay. Now, what he also could have done then is take 2 sheets and then covered the buckets with the sheets. That would give an extra layer of insulation. And did she say what time in the day he did that?
It was done when she got home. So
which is what?
About 6.
Okay, that's one problem with everybody working. If you watch her on a day like that, if you watch the thermometer, unless the front passes through in the morning, usually at 4 o'clock is your high point in temperature, and then it starts going down 1 to 2 to 3 degrees per hour. So if you're at home and another day like this comes up this spring, which it might, then get out there at 4 o'clock, cover things up, and if you can double the insulation, that's even better. And what you're doing is, in part, you're keeping the cold air from settling down around your plants. But also, by insulating, that's like you going to bed at night and putting on the blanket, because the ground, you see, then is radiating warmth back up to the plants. Okay. Boy, the lights here is bad. Why don't you read this? Since starting about, this is for the next month or so from where my finger is. We got out in the newspaper the upcoming programs, unless we run into something and change it.
So today we're talking about asparagus, potatoes, and tomatoes. June 2nd, we'll talk about beans and squash and birds. June 16th, we'll talk about strawberries. And June 30th, harvesting beets, carrots, lettuce, broccoli, and
Radishes?
bugs.
Oh, and bugs. We're not
harvesting bugs.
No, we're not eating the snails. Forget that. I am part French, but I'm not eating snails. But we'll talk about, yeah, it's usually, except for the asparagus beetles, usually it's late June that the 2 or 3 that are a nuisance, for me anyway, begin to show up. So how we can deal with that. Okay. If we do this again next year, we either have to start in February, because we have gotten out of sync with when we should be planting things. So I'm trying by squeezing in 3 things, 2 of which should have been done a month or 2 ago. But take notes for next year, right? Gardeners are always making lists of what went wrong, what went right, what should I do next year? Okay, so what am I going to start with? Why don't we start with the asparagus? We didn't ever talk about asparagus here, did we?
I don't think so.
Okay. That's one of those crops that if you move every 2 or 3 years, some people do that. They rent or they buy a house and whatever, and then they move in 2 or 3 years. Then don't plant asparagus. Because it's one of those crops that takes patience. If you plant it like I did, because my old bed finally died out after 20-some years. I've gone through now 2 beds at my house on top of the hill. So this will be my 3rd. And this year it's gonna hopefully all grow from the crowns and be spindly, and not, you don't do anything this year. Next year, you don't pick any either, because asparagus is one of those plants that lasts a long time, but it takes a couple of years to really get established. By the 3rd year, you can do a light harvest. And then by the 4th year on, if you're still alive, you're good to go. So it's not for everybody. However, once again, if you've ever tasted real asparagus from your garden, when it's only 6 to 8 inches tall, snapped off, brought in, cooked and eaten, it may be worth it. So if you decide you want to do this, let's say you already have a big garden, find one end of it, maybe the west end, or the end furthest away from your house. And remember, rows go north and south. So for my garden, then it's on the west end. Right? And eventually you're going to need about a 4-foot wide bed, because asparagus roots really do go out that far. They won't the first year or 2 or 3, but eventually they will. Now, in the meantime, you can grow things like lettuce and spinach, on the edges.
Mhm.
You don't need all that 4 feet for the first couple of years, but down the middle of that 4 feet. Okay. Do you remember how, or did you ever have asparagus, or your parents or anybody?
Grow it?
Yeah,
No.
no. Okay. In the old days, it was a hard job.
Hmm.
They wanted you to dig a trench.
Hmm.
Here in Allegheny County, 2 feet deep? No, you'd hit bedrock or you'd hit hard clay and, anyway, even up on the hills outside here where the sand and gravel, the glacier dumped games. In the old days, they'd want you to dig 2 feet down,
Hmm.
fill it with a lot of compost and manure. That was a great thing in the old days when there were a lot of horses around. And fill it into about, well, I don't know, maybe a foot deep with all of that. And then you'd set your crowns down in about a foot deep. And usually it was 1 year crowns. Don't waste money on 2 year crowns. They don't get you a harvest any sooner. They're bigger and they're more expensive, but they take just as long to get established. So then what you would do is you would only cover them with like 2 inches, because even an asparagus couldn't go through a whole foot. So, and as the summer progressed, you'd gradually add in soil till by the fall, your trench was filled. The crowns were down about a foot. There was a lady, I think I mentioned her before. Remember Ruth Stout? How to have a green thumb without an aching back?
Yep.
She was in her 40s when she moved out of New York City, I think it was. I think it was up to Connecticut. Bought an old farmhouse, an acre or two of land, and of course, back in I think it was the 40s, give or take 5 or so years. Had to have a big garden. And in those days, it was always some old guy in the neighborhood who had a horse who would come around in the spring and plow your garden. But she'd been thinking about how Mother Nature does things, except for floods or earthquakes sometimes. Mother Nature never plows. She just drops seeds on top of the debris, things grow. So she came up with this idea. It wasn't originally hers. Some guy in India, many decades before, thought of this, of mulching. Pile a bunch of hay. She used hay on your garden soil. Don't dig. And just pull the hay aside and plant whatever, potatoes, onion sets, asparagus roots or crowns. And things like seeds, you would just sprinkle them on the top, basically. Maybe cover them with an inch or so of leaves. Well, she started a movement in America. And that was about the time in the 60s that I started gardening. And I read her book. So I'm not as extreme that I have 8 inches of, say, leaves everywhere. But in certain circumstances, I do. And since many of us in Allegheny County have shallow topsoil and a tight clay subsoil that does not drain well, anything that has roots and a crown is not going to do well in soggy soil. So I decided almost 40 years ago when I had my first one put in that I was going to use her method. And I think what I did this time was now I have a good 12 inches at least of good topsoil. Over the years, you get rid of the rocks. You know, it's like Rome's not built in a day. If you have 1,000,000 rocks and you do 100,000 a year, that's 10 years. They're not quite that bad. So now I just make a trench about 2 inches deep and about a foot or so wide. And I if you've ever seen a crown and the asparagus roots, they're like fingers and they're long. And sometimes they're broken, you know, and they dig them up. And so I give them a bit of a haircut. So maybe when they spread the roots out, they're about a foot around. And I put them down in there, and then I pretty much cover them up with the 2 inches of soil. Then as they grow during the summer, instead of adding more soil, I simply, for me, it's leaves under pine needles. And so, you know, maybe 2 inches every month or so, you wanna, they have to keep growing on top. And they start to fern out, you don't need them. So by the end of the growing season in October, there's 2 inches of soil and probably at least 6 inches of loose mulch on top, maybe 8 inches. Now, let me think. Because I have good rich soil and because I mulch every year and that deteriorates, breaks down, provides not as much of a fix as chemical fertilizers would. But if your soil is good to begin with and you constantly mulching, I've never had to fertilize my asparagus. What I do have to do, because I live on a windy hilltop, pretty much, the second year, I simply run maybe every 10 feet or so, a 4-foot, well, I suppose the stake has to be 5 feet, you pound it down in a foot, so it's sticking up shoulder height, because your asparagus will get head high if you have good soil. If your soil isn't that good, maybe it'll only be shoulder high in the summer when it burns out. So I run, depends on how long a row you've got. I only need 3 poles on each side. And then I get some twine, gardening twine, and I tie around maybe 2 feet high and then near the top. And this way, and then sometimes I run a zigzag through from side to side, which gives a gentle support to the ferns. And when the wind comes, they blow around, but they don't blow over. If they were a foot down on the ground, you wouldn't have to do that because they're anchored. All right, let me think. If you decide you want to add a fertilizer of some sort, organic or chemical, the best time to do it would be late March, because nothing's going to show until usually May, pop up in early May, but the roots are starting to grow late March through April. So that would be the time to do your fertilizer. All righty. So they've grown all, they usually start popping up in early May, especially with global warming. They've moved up about a week or two. You can, once your 3 years are gone by, you can harvest 2 months. So in the old days, it used to be early in May to the 4th of July. Because if you keep harvesting, what's going to happen?
Well, I assume the flavor's not going to great.
Well, not so much that. Think of it as a pantry. If you keep raiding the pantry until it's empty, it's empty.
Right.
The crowns, the roots need the rest of the summer to make more food from the photosynthesis and the ferns. I call them ferns. The asparagus stalks then grow about 3-4 feet high and they fern out. And that is all stored down in the roots in the ground, which is why the asparagus is one of the first things that comes up that you can eat in the spring. So do your May, June, 2 months, and you don't need your strings up at then, because you harvest it 6 to 8 inches tall, and you can do it one of 2 ways. You can just snap it off, or you can cut it off right at the soil line. As soon as July comes and starts ferning out, that's when you need to run your stringer out. Do it before it starts ferning out, because that'll be much simpler, especially if you zigzag between the rows. All right, in the fall, and once again, it used to be the 3rd week in September when the frost came. Now it goes into October. They stay green throughout October. But when they turn yellow in the fall, you cut them off at the ground. Now, I think we were here offhandedly. I was reading that book, Garden Secrets, and I suddenly realized I was doing something wrong all these years and never knew it. We'll get to the asparagus beetle in a minute. I used to take all the yellow dying tops and put them on my compost heap, right? That's what you do. because, well, in a minute we'll talk about it, the asparagus beetle winters over in the stalks. So you're just providing a nice winter home for them on the warm compost heap. All righty, so you, or I think for me, I only have a 20-foot row, but they go 4 feet high and it's 2-3 feet wide. So I'm not gonna bag it up and take it to the dump. I'm gonna burn it. So and usually, I don't know, if you live in town, you can't burn them. So then you're gonna have to cut them up and bag them and get rid of them. All right. What's the oh, and then in the fall, once again, all summer long, your leafy mulch is decaying and shrinking. So probably you're gonna need 6 inches of loose fluffy on top in the fall, maybe 8 inches, after you've cut them down to the ground. The asparagus beetle usually shows up in the middle of May before it ferns out. And it's easy to spot. You got to get up early in the morning when, bugs need the warm sun to warm up and be agile. It's much easier to catch them when they're cold and not moving fast. Okay. The asparagus beetle is about 1/2 inch long and reddish. Easy to spot, even especially in the sunlight. And I didn't have that many, and they didn't show up for the first 5, 6, 7 years. But once they find you,
they remember.
Well, they make babies.
Yeah.
And then those babies, the eggs or whatever, winter over in my compost heap all those years. So anyway, but I told this story. I think I told this story about the first summer that I spotted them. And so I got there early in the morning, every morning. And there was only like 3 or 4 or 5, 6 maybe. But by the third, they were on the stem and I could grab them and squish them. For the third morning, they saw me coming and most of them dropped down into the litter. I couldn't get them. So they're not dumb. They recognize me. Oh, here she comes. We better we better move. And essentially they just let go and drop. And then they disappear in the leaves. So I thought that was pretty funny. Annoying, but funny. All right, asparagus. What else do we need to know about asparagus? What sort of questions do you have?
Is wild asparagus the same?
If it's asparagus, yes, I think there's 1 or 2 things that sort of look like asparagus, but yes. Oh, very good, because I didn't mention asparagus. It's like us. It comes in males and females. And so sometimes you can pay a little more and get just one or the other. Because most asparagus that we buy these days, like many vegetables, have been hybridized, which means you don't want them to make babies because the babies will not be like what you bought.
Sure.
Yeah. So my asparagus, I'm not sure about I'll tell you what kind in a minute. My new bed, I don't know. Maybe that was a little sexed. They didn't say. But the one I had for 20 years had both male and female plants. And the female plants, like the holly bush, has in the late summer the little red berries. And I never had much of a problem with self-sowing. But every now and again you can see a baby asparagus pop up the next year. Just pull it out, especially with the mulch. Because at that point, is it rooted in the ground and it'll just come right up. So I've never had a problem with that. Another thing it seems like asparagus was my weak point as far as not knowing the truth. And I actually thought it was the opposite. Now I gotta remember what's what. Double check it, folks. I think I got it right, but you know how it is. You get it wrong in the brain and it's hard to change. The males have thicker but less stalks. The females are thinner, I think, and have more stalks. So the advertisement used to be, you want the fat stalks. Well, that's not necessarily true, because if you weigh them pound for pound, more thin ones equals less fat ones. Did I get that right? Yeah. So double check it online, because I think that's the way it is these days. All right. What else? Okay. Cooking.
Mm.
If you're a gourmet, have you seen the asparagus pot for cooking?
No.
Oh, it's, I don't know, say it's 8 inches in diameter and it's about 10 inches deep. And I think you only put a couple of inches of water in the bottom, double check it online or in a cookbook. And then you set your stalks in this way, because the bottom is tougher than the tops. And if you simply, like I used to do, cut them all up, like in 2-inch pieces, dump them in the pot and cook them all together, your tops are going to be overcooked and the tip bottoms might not be cooked enough.
Sure.
I don't have a fancy pot like that, but so what I do is, usually the bottom third I cut off, keep it separate. That's what I freeze in the freezer for basically cream of asparagus soup in the winter. I don't pretend, some things like peas freeze well, carrots you can freeze well. Green beans and asparagus, for some reason, when you freeze them, they're just not the same. They're kind of mushy. So the bottom third of the stalks, if I'm going to freeze anything for the winter, that's what gets frozen, and that I make it into a cream of asparagus soup, which is okay. The tops then you just cook for 2 or 3 minutes. Butter and salt. When I get, after a month of eating asparagus, I get a little bored. So then I just cook the whole top, whatever, half, third of the stalk, and chill it, put it in the fridge. Next day, I take some out and I use blue cheese in this particular case. Just drizzle blue cheese and eat it cold. So that's the 2 ways. Well, how do you do it? Do you?
I usually use it, whenever I cook asparagus, I'm usually like doing like other things, so I usually put it on a sheet pan, in the oven. Like
Roast it.
Yeah, I just drizzle it with olive oil,
Well,
salt, pepper.
I have to try that.
Put it in the oven.
At like what, 350?
Yeah,
For
just
10 minutes or so, 5 minutes? All right. I have to try that. I have a recipe and haven't gotten around to using it, and it's quite beautiful. It's basically a quiche. There's a crust and then the quiche, and then you arrange in a radius like spokes all your asparagus stalks. From the center. Looks really pretty. Okay. All right. I think, is that it on asparagus?
I think so.
Okay. And what time is it?
It is 12 o'clock.
All right. We'll zip through the potatoes, which I'm hoping, I planted them 3 weeks ago. And they really haven't pushed through the leaf mulch yet. So because 28 degrees would have killed the potatoes, I think. Now maybe they would resprout. By the way, going back to the frost, my yellow squash, even though it was covered with a towel and a bucket, does not look happy. And my pumpkin. However, years ago, I was off at a retreat in late May, and we had one of those freaky frosts like we used to have all the time. And I thought, oh my God, I'm not home to cover anything up. Sure enough, the pumpkin was dead as a doornail. I don't know where that expression comes from. But instead, for some reason, instead of pulling it out, I simply took the scissors and cut it off at ground level. And that pumpkin came back from the roots. So if something like anything, my nasturtiums kind of got zapped, even though they were doubled with a towel and a bucket, they don't look happy. So I'm leaving them for a week or two and see what happens. I think the nasturtiums will perk back up, but the squash and the pumpkin, I may have to cut off again and hopefully see if it comes back. So don't be too much of a rush to yank up what you think was killed by the frost. All right, potatoes. are in the same category as roof stouts, mulching, no digging. Traditionally, potatoes are interesting. Where to start? Before we start we'll talk about the potato. If you can buy a whole potato, not one from the groceries. I thought, did we talk about this last week? I thought.
I think we touched on it.
Touched on it?
Yeah. I
Okay,
remember talking about my little seed potatoes.
right. Well, I'll very quickly review it because sometimes people don't watch the whole series or they just pop in for certain things. If you can manage, her name is Doreen, and they have something called High Country
Oh, up on the hill.
up on the hill. What is it
Country
called?
Crossroads?
Country Crossroads. Thank you. That's one of the few places that I know of around, and they're between Andover and Greenwood on the old 17, top of the hill between the two. They will sell not only whole potatoes, but bulk seed.
Mhm.
So if you're frugal or on a strict budget, it's worth going there because then you can, a handful of peas is like seeds is like a fourth of what you'd pay through the catalogs
Mhm.
or those pretty little packages in the stores. And it's best to buy whole potatoes. And then you look at the potato, and usually it has eyes. You can see where the eyes are. Usually, most of them are on one end, but there's always one or two down the other end. Cut it up in such a way that each piece is the size of a good egg
Mhm.
and has two, but no more than three eyes. Those eyes will make the stems, and you'll get the most potatoes out of the hill if you have between 2 and 3 stems, and the potato was big enough to support early growth. It's like the chick and the egg.
Mhm.
The first growth comes from the potato before the roots establish.
Right.
Okay. And what you can do is called chitting, if that's how you pronounce it, Chitting. And I don't know who came up with this, if it was the Brits or what. But about 5 days or so before you plant the potato, if you are going to cut it up, you want it to callus over, to heal, so it's less susceptible to fungi, I think, or mold. So you cut up your pieces, you put them on a tray, cut side up, you can manage that, and do not put them in the sunshine. They're in your house, in the light, but not in the direct sun. And you let them sit there and get calloused over before you plant them. Now, when you plant them, traditionally, what people did was, let's say I'm going to have a 20-foot row of potatoes, and they would have at least 2 feet wide. Now, if your soil is deep and rich, you can get away with 1.5 foot wide. Or a double row, that'd be 3 feet wide. And they would plant those potatoes, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 inches down, I think. Once again, more work, even with the trowel. If everything's loose and worked up, and you've got the trowel, 6. Okay. Ruth says, forget that. She planted them right on the surface and then covered them with, in the beginning, 2 inches. And then as they began to grow in June, another 2, and then another 2 in July, because you want to keep the tubers are growing at the surface. If you planted them on the surface, at the surface, and then as the plant continues to grow, they continue to make more tubers higher up the stem. So by August, if you haven't been adding mulch every month, they're beginning to poke out and they get sunburned. You don't like that. You can't, they turn green, it's poisonous. You got to peel that all away. So that was one of the reasons they planted them deep. And then what they would do is, let's say you planted them the 3rd week in April. Either way, 6 inches down or under a pile of leaves. It would take about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the weather, for them to pop up. So now let's say we're in early May sometime. So keep an eye out on the weather report because they're not that hardy. And if you have all this mulch around and it's going to go down, say below 30, just go out with the rake at 4 or 5 in the afternoon and rake the leaves over the leaves. And in the morning at 10 o'clock, you got to rake them back on.
Mhm.
Okay,
And you can plant those deeper because they're getting their nourishment from the potato itself.
at the beginning, but the roots
Mm-hmm.
will, okay, if you plant it, say, on the surface and then mulch it, the roots will go down into the soil.
Okay.
Now, I tried that 1 or 2 years, and my problem was, even with my 2 cats, I don't know if it was the voles,
Mm.
the mice. I can never remember. One's a vegetarian and the other eats insects. I think the mice eat seeds and plants, and the voles eat
Mm.
bugs, I think. Anyway, something underneath the mulch, but on top of the soil,
Mhm.
nibbled away on my potatoes,
Mm.
which is really annoying. So what I do is compromise.
Mhm.
I plant them 2 inches deep under the soil, and then I mulch them about 2 inches in late April when I plant them. And then by middle of May, when they're up a little bit, I put another inch or two around.
Mm.
And I keep doing that until like the end of June.
Mhm.
By then, they're underneath 8 inches plus 2 inches of soil.
Mhm.
Alrighty.
Is there a difference between using seed potatoes and like your regular whole potato?
Okay, cut up. A seed potato, they've done it for you. But being the industry, what's their main concern?
Um, Money.
Money. So if you order seed potatoes through the catalog, you're gonna get something like barely the size of a walnut.
Mhm.
You're just not gonna get a heavy production from that,
Right.
because it's just not enough oomph to get it going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I experienced.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay,
and I mean, my harvested potatoes were smaller than the seeds.
yeah.
They're so tiny.
Well, that might have also been you didn't water them that summer, right? They were in a barrel or something.
Yeah, they were in a barrel.
And yeah. Okay, but that was part of it.
Yeah.
Alrighty. I've told this story so many times. You folks probably heard it too. The time I went to get my peaches in August from Joseph's up in Naples, which is, by the way, a very good place to get your stuff because almost always it's quality.
Mhm.
You don't come home with a bushel of peaches that after 3 days begins to rot.
Mhm.
Which does happen sometimes. Never there. So anyway, I was up there and there was a beautiful basket. Nice big peaches. It was in August. I canned them, so you went clean free. And there was no label on it as to what it was. So a young gal was there helping out, and I asked her, what kind of peaches are these? You remember that? What did she say?
Yeah.
They're yellow. Yes, they were yellow, but that was not the answer. And see, so many people who eat food from the store,
Mhm.
a peach is a peach is a peach, and they're all quite mediocre,
Mhm.
truthfully. But if you want to can or freeze or make a pie or eat it fresh, and with apples, this is even more so. There are different varieties for different things. So anyway, potatoes. I just remember in general, most red potatoes are early potatoes, and they're the ones you use for boiling or scalloped potatoes or creamed potatoes.
Mhm.
It has something to do with the kind of starch in the potato.
Mhm.
The others, I say others, Pontiacs, Kennebecs, Russets,
Mhm.
the ones that tend to be ovally and have brown skins,
Mhm.
they're the ones that you get for mashed potatoes, baked potatoes,
Mhm.
French fry potatoes. And they're also mid-season and late.
Mhm.
So I usually grow two kinds. I grow the Norland, which is an old variety of red, which I like, and either russet or Pontiacs for later in the season. And then I've tried to mash those red potatoes and they get gooey. It has something to do with the kind of starch or the amount of starch. Alrighty. Then I think last summer when we were doing this, I brought in late July a Norland potato that was red in this round. And if you plant it close to the surface, then about 2 weeks after the bloom, which is usually in the middle to late June. So sometime around the middle of July, you can sneak your hand in there, feel around, and find the first biggest potato and harvest it,
Mhm.
not disturbing the rest of the plant, which will continue to grow and make potatoes, and the ones that are there will get bigger and bigger.
Mhm.
If it's a drought, I want you to look that up after we get off, and then next time we'll know. You know, they do have long range predictions. I have a feeling, I watered my garden this
Mhm.
morning.
Mhm.
So anyway, you can start, so if you have a 15-foot row with 15 hills, once the middle of July comes, about 3 times a week,
Mhm.
I like my potatoes,
Mhm.
1 potato from each hill.
Mhm.
So through July, August, you've been able to harvest an early potato from each of the hills,
Mhm.
letting the rest grow. Then usually those are ready to harvest because they're an early short season by the end of August. And in a month or two, we'll talk about the second garden in the summer. There'll be some space left for September and October. What are you going to do with it? The rest usually go through September before you harvest them. Okay. Bugs. We'll save the bugs for next time because I'm running out of time. We're not going to get to tomatoes. Don't use manure on your potato row because that'll create scab, which roughens the skins. You don't like to eat them when they're all rough like that. What else? Can't think of anything right now. Oh, okay. What do we have time for tomatoes?
You have 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay. Let me just glance here. Where did I do with the potatoes? Right. They do like a pH around 6. So like most things in the garden do fine between 6 and 7. But potatoes and strawberries, for one, tend to like it a little more acidic. And that will help with the scab also if you have a problem with it. All right. And once again, the row should be however long you want it. And if you have good, rich, deep soil, you can go by with 1.5 foot wide. And I would suggest trying my method, 2 inches down, and then a couple inches of loose leaves or pine needles and leaves, or early hay that's been rained on but doesn't have the flower seeds yet. Okay, tomatoes. Tell me what you know about tomatoes.
They're disgusting.
Oh, you don't like them?
No, I do not like tomatoes.
I didn't know that.
I don't like their slimy little seeds. They get all over me.
Well, you ought to write to the people that are working on making the
Yeah.
perfect whatever. I want a tomato with no seeds. Like they have watermelons with no seeds now, right?
Right.
So why can't they do it with tomatoes?
I love the look of tomatoes, and I see people eating like tomato sandwiches, and I wish I could do that.
Yeah, I do like lettuce, tomato, and bacon sandwiches, I must admit. Well, tomato. I was thinking, some of the most popular foods in the world as far as volume eaten, corn, tomatoes, and there's a third one, it's eluding me right now. Oh, tobacco. Where do they all come from? The New World.
Oh, right.
Europe and Asia did not know about tobacco or tomatoes or corn and a few other things.
And did the potatoes?
And potatoes, that's it, of course, thank you. Yes, potatoes, all of which are dominant food sources now, which I think is kind of interesting. However, when the tomato first went, I'm guessing to Spain, it's a member of the nightshade family, which is a deadly poison plant. Nobody ate them for hundreds of years, at least 200 years. I forget who the brave soul was and which country it was. They were growing them as ornamentals, like in the flower garden. And anyway, sometime look it up, double check. somewhere in the 1700s, somebody in Europe took that, like Eve, that
Yeah.
first bite and didn't drop dead.
Right.
So, okay,
And they knew it was a member of the nightshade.
yeah. Don't ask me how they knew that. I don't, maybe the leaves look alike.
Oh,
Anyway, yeah, okay. Tomatoes basically come in first two types. Determinate, which will only grow so high, and then within a month usually produce all their tomatoes at one time. So when you live like we did, it's less true now, in a short growing season, the only kind of tomatoes years ago we grew here were determinate tomatoes, because you could start them indoors about 5 to 8 weeks ahead of time. And then in those days, it was Memorial Day weekend, you could put them out with the box and the blanket handy, just in case. And then you would have tomatoes by late August. And then the frost would come in a month, usually
wow.
the third week in September. So, yeah, you really needed the short day, that not, don't forget that, not short day. You needed a tomato that would ripen within a short time span. And that was a determinants. The indeterminate, think Jack's beanstalk. If you lived in the tropics where tomatoes originated millions or however years ago, they just keep going up. And I remember Chester Galley, who was one of the master gardeners years ago. He had a tomato in his greenhouse that went up and along the ceiling and then around the ceiling, and it just kept growing because it was an indeterminate kind. So those are those, and you need poles for those.
And it are certain, is like the indeterminate better for certain kinds of tomatoes or?
I don't know. I don't know. I was going to say, I always grew what was called Oregon Spring, and it was developed out in the state of Oregon by their agricultural department for a short season tomato, and it was determined. And I've liked it. It's a medium-sized tomato, and it would give me tomatoes by the beginning of August. Now, if I really work on it, probably by the middle of July. And then it'll keep going for about 2 months and then peter out. But my daughter has the ones she chose tend to be indeterminate, which means we've got to put up poles. Jet Star being one, Cherokee Purple, which is evidently an heirloom, is another one. Now, okay, so let's bounce over then to, besides those two categories, you have what I would call a regular slicing tomato. Beefsteak, the biggies for sandwiches or salads or whatever. And then there was a paste tomato. In the old days, it was called Romano, and they were about this big, and they were less juicy. So if you wanted to make your own tomato sauce, which I did in the old days, or even once I made ketchup.
Oh, I love homemade ketchup.
Do you?
It's so good. Yeah, so I'll eat ketchup, but.
Well, Ronald Reagan once said what was it? Oh, it was school lunches. People were complaining that there were no vegetables for school lunch, and Ronald Reagan said, "Well, they've got ketchup, don't they?"
That's a lot of ketchup.
Okay, so anyway, in more recent, okay, so I'm not sure about the Romano type paste tomatoes for sauce, which kind they are, determinate or indeterminate. Yeah, I'm going to try maybe growing one of those again not this year, it's too late, next year. But in the recent, what has it been 10, 20, 30 years? I don't know. The recent past gets away from me. Cherry tomatoes and grape tomatoes, they tend to be indeterminate, I think. And you'll get a truss, truss, I think, that long with maybe 18 this size tomatoes on them. Like fat cherries, or some are even smaller. And some are yellow or orange, or there's one that I think I'm tempted to have my daughter grow next year if she will. It's almost like a purpley color.
Mm.
It looks so pretty. I'm not sure I want to eat a purple one, but it looks pretty.
Yeah, they do look pretty.
Okay.
And then you get a seed and it grows real sad.
All right. To each his own. Okay, so tomatoes. I'm a great advocate. Once again, if you go to the catalogs, tomatoes, there are hundreds of varieties.
Mhm.
You can get lost in like, if you have a hard time making decisions,
Yeah.
don't do this.
Yeah.
Because you'll be there all February trying to decide which of the 100 you want to grow. But the taste, some are more acidic, some are
Mhm.
sweeter, milder, some are hardier. They've been breeding out of Siberia in the last 30 years, interbreeding, to get a hardier tomato. Decide what you want, and then really about 8 weeks before. So for me, that would be about the third week in March, middle of March,
Mhm.
you start them indoors.
Mhm.
Then you can have, I'm gonna try Amish paste
Mm.
next year, which I don't know where that originated. I'm assuming with the Amish. It's a paste tomato,
Mhm.
bigger than the Romano. So we'll see. It's supposed to be really tasty. Start them indoors. You really do need grow lights. We won't spend any time on that now. Maybe later in the summer when I don't know what to talk about. And then harden them off for a couple of weeks, and then you put them out middle of May, late May, with a box handy, because who knows what the weather's gonna do. And tomatoes are very tender. So, let me think. I have never had trouble with bugs.
Mhm.
Two tricks of the trade is they really like calcium and magnesium. So in the winter, I save up my eggshells, heat them up on the top of the wood stove on the trivet till they're really dry,
Mhm.
crush them up in my hand with my thumb, and save them in a jar. And then when I plant my tomato, I sprinkle a good handful of the eggshells, calcium. I'm not sure if they have magnesium as well.
Mhm.
Some people like to put Epsom salts that you use to soak your feet or something, because that has magnesium in it. Now, did you ever go, when you were younger or now, in the spring or no, in the summer, go swimming in a farm pond?
Mhm.
Did you did you float and swim and stay horizontal in the top foot of the water?
Yes,
And what would happen if you let your feet sink down?
they would freeze.
They would freeze. Alrighty. The lower down in the pond you go, the colder it gets. The same is true of the soil. And since tomatoes really like a warm soil, unless you've done something to warm up your soil, even by late May, you stick your thermometer down in, and it's going to be quite a bit cooler.
Mhm.
So instead of planting your tomato down into that cold,
Mhm.
you make a trench. My pot of tomatoes are about the pots are 6 inches in diameter. And by the time they're ready to go out, they have filled up you can see all the roots everywhere. They're ready to go. They're ready to get out of the pot. And my plants are this tall by now and thick.
Mhm.
You have to buy them in the store, look for thick stems, dark green leaves. I pluck off or cut off all the lower leaves,
Mhm.
leaving just the top 5 or so. Then I lay down in the trench the tomato plant,
Mhm.
sideways. Fill in, cover it up, leaving the top exposed, and it's lying sideways.
Mhm.
But by the next morning,
Oh.
it has stood up.
Oh.
So what you've done is you've planted your tomato plant in the warmer top 4, 5, 6
Mhm.
inches of soil. And by removing all the lower leaves, that's going to make new roots. Everywhere you plucked off a leaf, stem or a leaf, new roots. So you're allowing your tomato plant to make lots more roots, which means it'll grow much more quickly and produce more tomatoes. Then I put the stake in at that time. Well, no, I don't, because I want to be able to put my box over it
Oh.
if it gets cold at night. So I usually wait till middle of June or so. then the box goes away. And the stake goes in.
Mhm.
And then, it's best to keep, you decide, 1 to 3 stems. And you tie them, every 8 inches or so.
Mm.
So they stay upright. And the interesting thing about the frost in the fall, cold air sinks.
Mhm.
Laura had a 7-foot Jetstar a couple
Mhm.
summers ago. And we had a frost in early October. The tomato plant was Jack's beanstalk. It was still growing. It was still making tomatoes. The lower part of the plant froze. The leaves all turned black and fell off. Top didn't freeze. They continued to ripen on the vine for another, I think, week or so. So we're probably out of time. Any questions about tomatoes that I forgot? Blight. Since I don't buy my transplants from stores, it's less likely.
Mm.
And my garden is isolated. I don't think anybody within a mile or 2 of me has a vegetable garden.
Mhm.
I don't know for sure, but I think that's true. So I'm more, isolated.
Mhm.
And I haven't had any problem with early or late blight
Mm.
with either the potatoes or the tomatoes.
Mm.
So I'm sure I've forgotten something.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, so the frost comes whenever it comes in the fall. If just the small ones, I just toss in the compost heap. But any green tomato that's halfway big enough,
Mhm.
I just bring in the house. And you don't put them in the sun. You
Mhm.
put them on, say, a window,
Mhm.
light, not in the fridge, just in the room temperature. Some people like to wrap them in tissue paper, and I just let them sit
Mhm.
out. And over a week or 2 or 3, depending on how green they were. And some people like green fried tomatoes or whatever, they pickled tomatoes or something. But most of them will ripen up. They won't be quite as tasty. But
Mhm.
so what did I forget? I don't have
think
trouble
that's
with
it.
bugs. I do. I should experiment. Since my tomatoes are only medium sized, the Oregon Spring, usually the flower cluster is 6, 7 flowers. I pluck off the younger ones and let 3 of the first flowers in the clump bunch to grow, assuming 3 instead of 6 tomatoes. I'll have bigger ones, and I'd rather have slightly less tomatoes, but each one being slightly bigger. Now, if I was a true scientist, I would. Maybe I'll do that this summer. The left side, let them go, see what happens. And then I'll find out they're all big, and I'll say, "Oh, all those years I wasted my tomatoes."
Yeah.
Okay, guys, what's next time? What about
Next time was
squash, beans, which we should have done this time. Green beans, lima beans, dry beans. Oh, and pumpkins and squashes. How's that sound?
okay.
And birds. Oh, yes,
And
birds. Okay.